For those who may not, for those who are new and may not know Tim, usually he doesn't wear a beard, but he gave up on the grooming in the pandemic.
Found myself shaving every day for 8 weeks, and then I looked in the mirror and said, "Why am I doing this?" So,
All right. I'm turning you up a little bit, but I can hear you pretty well now with the speakers a little bit louder. So if anyone out there who couldn't hear very much of Tim, just turn up your speakers a little bit. All right. It is 12:05, so let's start the webinar. Welcome everyone out there. We are here with Tim Chambless, Professor of Political Science at the College of Behavioral Science at the University of Utah. He's also teaching at the, or he's also working for the, or did work for the Hinckley Institute of Politics. He's got his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his master's and his PhD from the University of Utah. Go Utes. Hey, everyone out there, if you're alumni, welcome to this webinar again. Tim Chambless today. We give this an hour. We are time traveling back to 1973. Tim usually takes us, and now we can't, but usually he takes us to Washington, D.C. to meet all of Utah's representatives, senators. He will take us to the, actually to the Supreme Court. Fantastic dinners in Washington, D.C., a very cosmopolitan, obviously very cosmopolitan city. And since we can't do that, he agreed for us to have this webinar today to take us back to the Nixon era, actually, and a little bit of a comparative study. So I will get out of the room. Again, for those who are new to this, we have a lot of groupies, actually. My name is Christoph Dressler. I am directing Go Learn. That's the faculty-led travel program at the University of Utah. And Tim usually takes us to Washington, D.C., and now he brings Washington, D.C. and the year of 1973 to you. So thank you, Tim. I will be here in the background, but I will mute myself and get out of your way. So thank you, and hello. Thank you very much.
Christoph, thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this University of Utah Go Learn program noon lecture. The title of my lecture today, as you can see on the screen, is Washington, D.C., America's Capital in Crisis, Echoes of Richard Nixon. I will suggest that Richard Nixon, our 37th president, was a mentor for the current 45th president. Specifically, I will suggest that Richard Nixon and Donald Trump use law and order themes, plus racial fears, to win election. I'll focus on the years 1968, 1973, 2016, and 2020. Hopefully afterwards, we'll have some time for a lively question and answer period. I want to tell you at the outset that Washington, D.C. has been an interest, a fascination for me ever since dinosaurs walked the earth and I was in 8th grade. I worked there in the nation's capital. I lived there. My first time was indeed in 1973 when I had the good fortune to work for Utah Congressman Wayne Owens when he was a member of the House Judiciary Committee that was investigating President Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. I had the good fortune of being in the old Senate caucus room of the historic Russell Senate Office building, standing all day during the Senate Watergate hearings, chaired by Sam Ervin, Senator from North Carolina, the chair of the committee, and a historic figure I admired greatly. I also had the wonderful good fortune, serendipitously, while I was an intern on Capitol Hill, to live in the home of investigative reporter Jack Anderson from Salt Lake City for 3 months. Jack Anderson was investigating the Watergate scandal at the same time as Woodward and Bernstein. Together, the experience of working for a Utah congressman, investigating the Watergate scandal, while simultaneously living in Jack Anderson's home, resulted in giving me a professional career path. Subsequently, I wrote both my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation on the Watergate scandal, on Richard Nixon's relationship to it, and the efforts of Jack Anderson to uncover it. Okay, let's talk about Richard Nixon. 1968, elected president. 1972, re-elected president. 1974, August 9th, resigned. Avoided impeachment. If Nixon had not resigned, he would have been impeached, tried, convicted, and removed as president. Watergate, Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski told me in 1975 that he had planned to indict private citizen Nixon 2 months after leaving office, to put Nixon on trial where a jury might convict him, and Nixon could therefore join his closest White House aides in federal prison. As you know, this did not happen. It did not happen, because what happened was on September 8th, 1974, new president Jerry Ford, our only unelected vice president who became an unelected president, pardoned Richard Nixon for any crimes he might have committed while president for 5.5 years. Nixon did not pardon himself. Ford pardoned Nixon. Article 2, Section 2 gives the president the pardon power. Richard Nixon lived for 20 more years. He died in 1994, April 22nd, 1994, long enough to meet with other presidents and with men who wanted to be president, John Connally and Donald Trump. Curiously, there are echoes of Nixon's behavior in the public words and actions of the current occupant in the White House. Why? Well, let's consider Nixon's public persona, the public Richard Nixon. For years, he wanted to be president. As president, he valued loyalty over competence. Nixon listened to a few trusted advisors. He isolated himself from Republican Party members. He often threatened military force. Nixon greatly resented the news media, seeing news reporters as enemies. He liked to provoke and taunt his critics. This was Nixon's public behavior as president. But I need to ask, how about his private behavior? The private man revealed in the secretly recorded Watergate tapes in the White House. Nixon felt the need to act tough. He hated criticism and talked of revenge. He could not admit making any mistakes. Nixon would blame others for any mistakes. He was very quick to anger. Nixon often used profanity and name calling. Nixon was quick to stereotype people. He was insensitive to minorities, racial, ethnic, religious. He could not relate to people living in poverty. Curious, given his background, his upbringing. He felt he always had to win and feel superior. He hated being a loser on any issue. Question today, does this behavior remind you of anyone? The late Utah Senator Bob Bennett, who worked for Nixon and knew Nixon personally, told me, quote, Nixon was not comfortable in his own skin, that Nixon was, quote, a terribly insecure man who let his fears and his own personal demons control him. These Nixon traits, consider them. Do we hear echoes of the private Nixon today? When I try to understand the appeal of Richard Nixon, I think of my parents. Nixon often talked to the American dream, that he had risen from poverty to the presidency. My folks, they struggled. My parents' struggles give me insight into the 25% of Americans who, in 1974, according to the Gallup poll, supported Richard Nixon on the day he resigned and left office. My mom's family emerged from the Appalachian region of eastern Kentucky, moving to St. Louis for jobs. My dad grew up in poverty in the Texas Hill Country. World War II allowed my mother to become an Army nurse. In World War II, my dad was a pilot in the European theater, and afterward was able to attend college on the GI Bill. In 1969, Richard Nixon took office as president. My parents wanted to believe that Richard Nixon, a man whose own parents struggled and experienced hardship, a man from humble beginnings who was elected president, could somehow help them. My folks voted for Republicans, even for the rascals. They defended Richard Nixon's every action. So our Thanksgiving and Christmas gatherings were indeed quite provocative. All press criticism was unfair and communist inspired, they said. Nixon was being unfairly persecuted by his enemies, the left-wing news media, the liberal professors, the unpatriotic Congress, his own Republican Party, and the secret communists, the Democrats. My folks did not want to believe. They did not want to believe the unanimous ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court on July 24, 1974, ordering President Nixon to release his private property, the White House audio tapes secretly recorded. We know them as the Watergate tapes. 2 weeks later, my folks were grieving when Richard Nixon resigned, rather than remain to fight the impeachment process in order to vindicate his beliefs, attitudes, values, actions, and demonstrate his patriotism. August 9th, 1974, the day Nixon left the White House, my folks saw him as a victim. They had lost a patriot. His enemies had finally brought him down. They wanted to believe that Nixon, who had overcome poverty and hardships to become wealthy and powerful, still understood their daily struggles and their fears. My folks remind me of many 2016 voters who hoped Donald Trump would improve somehow their own economic conditions. Circling back to 1968, how has Richard Nixon's winning campaign served as a model for the 2016 election? In 1968, Nixon was thinking problem solving, problem solution. He hammered on perceived problems in the US. He listed problems the nation was experiencing. He appealed to fears many Americans were feeling. He then portrayed himself as the problem solver. Indeed, his campaign slogan in 1968 was, "Nixon's the one." Specifically, Richard Nixon in 1968 promised to restore law and order in America. He would be the law and order president. He campaigned against crime and disorder, he said. He declared, quote, "America must be respected." He said Democrats were, quote, "soft on communism." He blamed Democrats for raising taxes and budget deficits and social welfare spending. He criticized Democrats for the national debt. He refused to debate, interestingly enough, Democrats Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace, the third party candidate that year, both Democrats. He promised to appoint conservative justices. And secretly, he had aides meeting with North Vietnamese officials, indicating that a future president, Nixon, would offer a better peace than the current president, Lyndon Johnson. Today, the year 2020, do any of these conditions or promises sound familiar? In 1968, Richard Nixon declared that, quote, "the long, dark night for America was about to end." Well, November 5th, 1968, Election Day. Nixon's campaign focused on winning 7 states: California, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and my home state of Texas. Note, Nixon won California, Illinois, and Ohio with victory margins less than 3%. If Richard Nixon had lost those 3 states, he would have lost the presidential election of 1968. Nixon distrusted the vote count at polling places. He had 100,000 campaign aides at polling places, supervising the voter turnout. He did not want the election somehow stolen from him. He felt 1960 that had been the case. Okay, now, during the 2016 presidential campaign? What promises did Republican Party candidate Donald Trump make? Okay, let's look at the public Trump. He asserted that as president, he would repeal Obamacare, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, the healthcare program. That he would ban Muslim immigrants into the United States from certain countries. That he would build a wall around the United States and Mexico along the border between those two nations. That he would pressure US companies not to leave the US. He would undo international trade deals covering the last 25 years. He would cut taxes for US firms and raise import taxes. That he would eliminate many federal government regulations, and he would promote fossil fuels, not alternative energy sources. That he would increase the military budget by about $60 billion. He criticized NATO, NAFTA, Cuba, China, Iran. He criticized the CIA, FBI, NSA, EPA, and always all Democrats. He promised to appoint conservative justices to the US Supreme Court. And he declared that he would be the only one in the country able to, quote, make America great again. While meanwhile, curiously, he continually praised Russia's Vladimir Putin. Remember the 2016 presidential election outcome? Remember the 2016 popular vote results. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote with nearly 3 million more popular votes than her Republican opponent. But she is not the 45th president. Why? In short, the winner-take-all electoral college system, unique, that was created back in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. So that today Donald Trump has been the 45th president. But in 2016, a shift of 40,000 popular votes in 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, those 3 states, 40,000 vote shift would have made Hillary Rodham Clinton the 45th president. Note that 40,000 votes is less than the 46,000 seats in the University of Utah football stadium. That's how close the 2016 election was on popular votes. So then we have to consider a question. Did Richard Nixon and Donald Trump have a personal relationship? And the answer is yes. Richard Nixon, in a letter he wrote to Donald Trump, dated December 21st, 1987, encouraged the New York City land developer to consider being a candidate for high office. And the words are, and you can see them on the screen, "Dear Donald, I did not see the program, but Mrs. Nixon told me that you were great on the Donahue show. As you can imagine, she is an expert on politics, and she predicts that whenever you decide to run for office, you will be a winner." Now, in 1987, Donald Trump was floating his name in the New York media as a possible candidate for president among Republicans who were seeking to succeed outgoing President Ronald Reagan. It was a crowded field. Trump did not run. He would consider running in 2012, however, against Mitt Romney, but ultimately decided against that option. Jumping ahead, in 2016, as president-elect, Trump was interviewed on Fox News and spoke of this 1987 letter he received from Nixon. The president-elect said that he had not known the former president well, but that he had received other letters from him and observed, quote, "It was just amazing that he wrote it. It was very interesting. He always wanted me to run for office." Okay, this year, May 30th, May 25th actually, George Floyd was killed by a white man, a policeman, on a street in Minneapolis. The murder was captured on video and seen throughout the nation and throughout the world. Since then, our lives, our country has been changing. June 1st, 10 days ago, Monday evening, President Trump declared in the Rose Garden alongside the White House that he was, quote, the president of law and order. When I heard those words, my memories of the 1968 Richard Nixon jumped out at me. 52 years later, the same words, the same phrase. We must ask, in 1968 and in 2020, do those words from two Republican presidents have the same meaning? Well, two writers for the Huffington Post actually have said no. Paul Blumenthal, Kevin Robillard have argued that, quote, 2020 isn't 1968, and Donald Trump isn't Richard Nixon. Well, that's interesting. Let's consider those similarities and those comparisons. Federal troops and local police confronted minorities and local people sick of discrimination and brutality. Americans are dying in horrible numbers. Americans are angry at their president. Americans are very angry, and as a result, we also see many lawsuits that are pending in the federal courts. Their president sees peaceful demonstrators as enemies. Each president approved of pepper pellets, smoke grenades, nightsticks, tear gas against protesters. Each president said he was the voice of the majority. Let's consider the contrast, the differences. Trump supporters are not silent, and they're not in the majority. Trump is an unpopular president, always having public opinion poll ratings less than 50% in 3.5 years. In 100 years of modern polling, we've never had an incumbent president be polling less than 50% during the entire duration of his term. Trump has, each day, instigated chaos, confusion, disruption, ignorance, and acted in a dictatorial fashion. In 3.5 years, Trump has had over 20,000 documented public lies. Nixon began as a popular president and then plunged. Nixon signed bills he disliked but wanted consensus. Trump, like Nixon, had successes and failures. In 2015, Trump was one of 17 Republicans seeking the presidency. In 2015, the news media had not taken Trump seriously, but he took himself seriously. In July 2016, he became the Republican Party's nominee. In autumn 2016, during the nationally televised TV debates, 3 of them, Trump lost all 3 to Hillary Clinton. Public opinion polls predicted he would lose. But on November 8th, 2016, Donald Trump won the presidential election. Jump ahead 2 years. November 6th, 2018. Republicans lost the U.S. House, but they were able to maintain control of the U.S. Senate, 53-47. A year and a half since then, we've seen unprecedented daily conflict. So today, or 10 days ago, June 1st, 2020, we saw on that Monday evening peaceful protesters who were tear gassed and chased from Lafayette Square across the White House by police and soldiers on orders of Donald Trump, so he could have a walking photo opportunity to walk from the White House, to stand before historic St. John's Church and hold a Bible. And why do this? Why did this happen? In short, to the point, Donald Trump was perceived to have mismanaged a national health crisis, our pandemic. His plunging national public opinion poll numbers were dropping down to 37% approval. his anger over daily native news media coverage, and his urge to dominate, as he said, protesters in the streets for whatever reasons. Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution indicates that the president is the civilian commander-in-chief. Accordingly, all branches of the U.S. Military are subordinate to his directives. The founding fathers said that we would have a civilian commander-in-chief president really be the boss of the military. That's the theory in our experiment in democracy. Nixon understood this relationship. He understood it because he'd been a lawyer. He had been in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He had been a congressman, a senator, and vice president, and president. So Nixon was careful not to provoke rebukes from the professional military and Pentagon leadership. In stunning contrast, June 1st, President Trump, ordered members of the U.S. military to use violent tactics against Americans who were peacefully assembled, peacefully protesting, exercising their fundamental rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, specifically the First Amendment. In doing so, the 45th president acted unconstitutionally. He acted as a lawbreaker, proclaiming threats and speaking with no remorse. In doing so, he's created a constitutional crisis. America's experiment in democracy, George Washington's phrase, is now in harm's way. James Mattis, retired general who served as Trump's first Secretary of Defense, 2017 until 2018, year and a half, and therefore sixth in line to the presidency as Secretary of Defense, responded with these words, quote, "I have watched this week's unfolding events, angry and appalled. The words equal justice under law are carved in the pediment of the United States Supreme Court. This is precisely what protesters are rightly demanding." James Madison, he went on. James Madison, our fourth president, we say he is the father of the U.S. Constitution, wrote in Federalist 41, quote, "America, united with a handful of troops or without a single soldier, exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited with 100,000 veterans ready for combat." And Mattis goes on. He says, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership." And James Mattis concludes that we know that we are better than the abuse of executive authority that we have witnessed in Lafayette Square. We just reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our United States Constitution. At the same time, we must remember Lincoln's better angels and listen to them as we work to unite. Now, those are the words of retired General James Mattis, former Secretary of Defense. As of today, 4 former members of the president's cabinet with military backgrounds, as well as over 24 high-ranking members of the United States military, have agreed publicly with former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. June 8th, 1 week later, after the events of June 1st, President Trump said he, quote, "was the law and order president." His press secretary said, quote, "The president has no regrets about his actions on June 1st. Today, June 11th, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, the top United States military official, publicly apologized for standing alongside President Trump for his photo op 10 days ago. Today, General Milley said that his presence, quote, created a perception of the military involved in domestic politics. And for that, he greatly apologizes. He wished he had not done it. In conclusion, I began this analysis with the acknowledgement that Richard Nixon was the only president ever to resign. Nixon did so in order to avoid impeachment by the House of Representatives and a trial with conviction in the Senate. Last year, December 18th, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Donald Trump. Impeached, the president avoided a Senate trial. Meanwhile, he has continued to be an unprecedented president whose words and actions have been chaotic and divisive. In recent weeks, members of the president's own Republican Party in the Congress have been silent, stunningly silent, not speaking in support of the president. Only Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah has spoken and acted publicly to try to heal our divided nation. I would ask you to think problem solution. We see the problem, the behavior of an unstable and erratic and authoritarian chief executive whose words and actions are dangerous and unconstitutional. Such behavior has continued to divide the nation during a national health crisis and a deep economic recession. The current president survived an impeachment process, but can the nation survive his problematic leadership? It has not helped the nation and world that the current president has had problems telling the truth, that in the words of Colin Powell, expressed on national television last Sunday, on national news program, former general, former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and longtime Republican, Colin Powell observed, quote, Donald Trump lies every day, unquote, and that he would not be voting for Donald Trump. A problem solution, a solution. Impeachment by the House last December was rejected by the Senate last February. The election for president is November 3rd, more than 4 months away. There is another alternative solution available for concerned members of the House and Senate. The 25th Amendment, Section 4, mandates that when the Vice President and a majority of the House and Senate declare in writing to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House that the President is unable to perform the duties of his office, the Vice President immediately becomes acting President. Invoking the 25th Amendment, Section 4, would be unprecedented in this case. But we have an unprecedented president who appears unstable and incapable of bringing the nation together with wise leadership during this year of unprecedented national and international problems. Yes, Mike Pence has been more of a silent statue than a visible action-oriented leader. Nevertheless, he is the elected vice president and a former member of Congress, someone who understands that Congress is a co-equal branch of America's experiment in democracy. So I would ask you to think problem solution. Consider what I've said. Indeed, Washington, D.C. today, our nation's capital, is in crisis. There are echoes and ghosts of Richard Nixon residing in the White House. We see a dangerous governmental drama happening now behind high chain link fences erected by the president. He has indeed built a wall around the people's house, in the words of James Madison, to shield himself from the American people. And so we have to ask the question, when will that wall come down? And I can tell you as of today, portions of it are being taken down, the physical wall, but not the intangible, invisible walls between the American people and the chief executive residing as a public servant for a short period of time in the people's house, the White House. Imposing the 25th Amendment may very well be moot. As I said earlier, The presidential election is November 3rd. It's on the horizon, less than 5 months from now. James Madison said that the people, by their votes, can exercise a check, that is a control or a restraint, upon a corrupt or incompetent elected official. And James Madison said, if men were angels, then there would be no need for government. If not before November 3rd, then perhaps the high chain link fence erected around the People's House will be torn down on January 20th next year. But hopefully it's going to come down today or next week. Indeed, public opinion polls this week indicate Joe Biden is leading the current occupant in the White House by anywhere from 8 to 14 to 16% percentage points nationwide. I remember these words expressed by Alexander Hamilton when our nation was being created in 1787. And he said this at the Constitutional Convention, our country when it faced tremendous problems. Hamilton said, great ambition, unchecked by principle, is an unruly tyrant. Now, personally, I'm an optimist. I have confidence that our nation can survive this national trauma. I can see the current wall surrounding the White House erected by the current president being peacefully removed. I want that to happen. If not this week, then by a new president 7 months from now. Okay, enough said. Let's have a question and answer period. And maybe you can address questions by the chat method that we have here for Zoom. Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much for a history lesson, a comparative study, and thank you for all your input on this. I confess I was 1 day old when that photo was taken with Richard Nixon saluting from the helicopter and leaving the White House grounds. So I have a lot to learn.
You are young. Everybody together, everybody, all of us are young.
For those, you were in the hearings. You were standing there, you know, you were standing there on hours. What did it feel like in that time when you were there? And what did you do there? You were an intern at the Hinckley Institute, right?
And I had the good fortune of having this wonderful congressman from Salt Lake City, Wayne Owens, who said, Tim, this is an unprecedented learning experience. Go and be there. So you know what I did? I slept in the congressman's office that night before, and it's on his couch, got up, and I was standing in line at 3:30 in the morning outside the Russell Senate Office Building. I thought I'd be the first one in line. I was the fifth. And I remember a young reporter named Leslie Stahl from CBS News coming and interviewing all of us early birds who were there to hopefully get inside. Now, I got inside, I was fifth in line, but I had to stand all day. But I heard James W. McCord, May 18th, 1973, one of the 5 Watergate break-in burglars who worked for the CIA for 25 years. James W. McCord, by name, mentioned Richard Nixon, who was ultimately had given permission for that break-in of the Democratic National Party headquarters, the Watergate complex. That was lightning in the room. You could see the perspiration rising. The energy was just tremendous. The silence as McCord was speaking. It's high drama. It beats anything you would watch on daytime soap opera TV.
Wow, an eyewitness to history, and thank you for sharing what it felt like, what it was in the room. And obviously, many of our attendees were witnesses of that time as well and have memories. But you were on the floor in the hearing, so thanks for sharing all of that. So the chats have coming in, questions, Q&A. There's on the bottom of your screen for those who would like to have some questions. There's a chat option and there's a Q&A. Let's start with the chat option because that's the one that most people have used for some questions. So I'm going to scroll back a little bit in time. I'm not going to use names just because that's what we do. We just keep that anonymous. Let's see where the first one came in. Here we go. What to make of Republican lawmakers' silence and complacency?
Okay, today.
Yeah, I think that's what she means.
I think that they are in absolute fear of the voters. The election is now just a little bit over 4 months away, and they don't know what to say. And so the best thing they can do right now is silence. Mitch McConnell was at the White House yesterday talking to the president. Individuals who have made statements on social media or to the press have said, we wish the president would tweet less, the social media of Twitter or tweet, that they are not helpful to their campaigns. Keeping in mind, this year the Senate has 35 seats up, not out of the 100, 35. Now, typically you have about a third up. You have 23 Republican seats up, in contrast to only 12 Democrats. There is a very real possibility that the Democrats, while holding the House, will win the Senate as well as the White House. And if so, it's like the pendulum effect on the cuckoo clock that I have here in my house, that you'll see an undoing of basically all the executive orders that the president has imposed in the last 3 years plus. But meanwhile, the first condition of elected office holders is to win re-election, continued political life. And what we're hearing is stunning silence from them. Only from Utah's junior Senator Mitt Romney, who has openly paraded in Washington, D.C. with others, declaring that Black lives matter. Mitt Romney is the only Republican senator I'm aware of who was out there on the streets of Washington, D.C. the past week in that parade. And we have these parades going on in over 700 cities and towns in the United States right now, as well as cities throughout the world. In Salt Lake City yesterday morning at 6 a.m.
Okay, next question. Will disapproval of the military hierarchy be sufficient to preclude our leader's re-election?
A very good question, because the leaders, they've gone through the process of going to the the training to be professional leaders in the military. They've gone to the academies. They've been well schooled on our experiment in democracy, George Washington's phrase. They know that under our system of government, Article 2, Section 2, that the military is subservient to the civilian commander-in-chief. And so here we have a situation where the professionals in the military, including this morning, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, we choose the Constitution, not a particular individual who was hired in 2016 for a period of 4 years. We don't choose the president, we choose the Constitution. And so that's very, very important, because if not, we would be in a situation where many nations throughout the world have individuals that call themselves president, but they were generals who seized control of their governments. Our ongoing experiment lives in this country because our military has historically respected our civilian commander-in-chief authority, but also ultimately, in our theory of government, it's the people who are the sovereigns. And the people very clearly right now are looking at the current occupant of the White House as someone that they do not support or respect.
All right, tough stuff. We have another question. Do you think that Donald Trump's manipulation of the media, fake news, casting out reporters, allows him to have more power than Nixon did? Do you think he may have intentionally started talking about fake news due to the backlash that Nixon got after Watergate?
Certainly the men themselves, their anger towards and resentment towards the news media, whether it was 50, 52 years ago or today, was just tremendous. Tremendous resentment. The technology has changed. Back when there were the Watergate hearings, you had 3 major television stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, all 3 simultaneously covering the Watergate hearings. No soap operas, the Watergate hearings. And we had a number of radio networks. National Public Radio did not go on the air until 1971. Now, today what we have is the internet that really emerged at the end of the Cold War, 1991, 1992, and also social media, which really is in the last 2 decades. So that today, Donald Trump, who doesn't sleep well, doesn't eat well, gets up about 3 o'clock in the morning and will use Twitter, send out tweets to try to capture the news cycle before dawn. So that, and I've heard this from a number of reporters, they said we are obligated to at least explore, to look at what the president has said before 5 o'clock in the morning. And so in that way, the president drives the news cycle.
Yeah.
And then also the president has, in the words of Theodore Roosevelt, the bully pulpit, the presidency. So that in that way, he controls the attention of the American people. He can have live news coverage every day if he wants. We saw this for many days during the afternoon briefings dealing with coronavirus, with COVID-19. So in that way, we see him. Now, his perception is that when the public sees him being action-oriented, that's a positive for him. I think Joe Biden right now perceives that the most strategic thing he can do is stay out of the news media for the most part and let the president's poll numbers disintegrate as the American people look and see the president and they don't like what they see and they don't like what they hear.
All right, we'll move on to the next question. It's actually more a comment. It's thank you for a wonderful up-to-date analysis of our political situation. When is our next trip to Washington, D.C.?
Have it scheduled unofficially for May 23rd to May 29th, Sunday evening to Saturday morning. That's the week before Memorial Day weekend, but I don't think that's maybe it is already on the internet. It may already be posted.
Yes, we have it up. It's posted. It's at golearn.utah.edu, and the itinerary is there, so you can see what else we're doing on this trip. Hopefully, we're through this pandemic and are allowed to travel again. So we're having good faith that this will happen. So yeah, hopefully we can. And there are already a good number of participants on this trip. So thank you for everyone. If you're out there and you're already signed up for this, thank you for joining us and keeping up the good faith that at some point we get to travel again and get to enjoy a vacation with an education. Let's move on to the next one. Yes, will you please compare the pushback from Congress to Nixon versus Trump?
Okay. With Richard Nixon, throughout his 5.5 years as president, the Democrats, the opposition party, controlled the House and Senate. Now, Trump has been much more fortunate. When he was elected in 2016, the Republicans for 2 years controlled the House and Senate. In 2018, as we heard earlier, the Democrats won control of the House, but missed out on controlling the Senate. So we've had, by definition, divided government. Divided government. Historically, when you have divided government, what you have is both gridlock and the absolute need to work together on certain issues. But when we sit back and look at what Congress has done in the last 2 years, if not 4 years, for the most part, it's been very little of great significance.
Right. Let me switch over to the Q&A so we get, I think they came in earlier too. I realized that getting rid of the Electoral College would require a constitutional amendment. Is that at all possible?
Probably not. The mistake was made at the Constitutional Convention as a compromise, as well as long as with what was called the Three-Fifths Compromise, as a concession to southern rural states. We got rid of the Three-Fifths Compromise with the Civil War. Unfortunately, the Electoral College was maintained, and what we've seen as a result is with 45 presidents, the current president being the 45th, 5 times the individual who did not get the most popular votes won the presidency. And the last 4 of the 5 have been Republican candidates who entered the White House as minority presidents. Now, in 1968, Congress held serious hearings about doing away with the Electoral College, but nothing happened. After 2000, remember George W. Bush, after that election of 36 days, in which the Supreme Court on a 5-4 decision, the only court mentioned in Article 3 of the Constitution, chose the president under Article 2 to be in office. That's George W. Bush. There was also hearings, short-term hearings, about doing away with the Electoral College. Nothing happened. Now, we do see that incrementally, it's possible to change it somewhat. Example, the state of Maine, the state of Nebraska say that electors are chosen by congressional districts. So if we go back to the presidential election of 2016, Maine, a small state, half the size of Utah, with 2 representatives and 2 senators, total of 4 electoral votes. One of the 2 House districts, the very rural northern area of Maine, away from the coast, the folks there voted for the Republican candidate, and therefore he got 1 of Maine's 4 electoral votes. In other words, Hillary Clinton got 3, but Donald Trump got 1, total of 4 electoral votes coming from the state of Maine. Other states may do that. Legislators have introduced such legislation in Utah, but those bills have never gotten a hearing, never gone to the floor for a vote. But that is a possibility of one way to do away with the Electoral College. Otherwise, we probably will have to do away with it with an amendment like we did with Prohibition. Remember, 18th Amendment in 1920 established Prohibition. 13 years later, in 1933, the 21st Amendment erased Prohibition.
The 21st Amendment. That was my favorite bar in Boston when I lived there. All right, here comes a good question. Who would you suggest that Joe Biden choose as his vice presidential running mate?
Wow. I have pondered that question by the hour because on May 2nd, I had the honor of being chosen to be a national delegate for Joe Biden, which if there is a national convention in Milwaukee as scheduled right now, middle of August, I'm going to be there. My wife thinks that's not a good idea, but I'm thinking about going there even if I wear a mask all the time. Anyway, to the point. Given the events that we've seen in the last 2.5 weeks, since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and knowing that Joe Biden weeks ago promised a woman would be his running mate, which makes such sense for many reasons. 52, almost 53% of our population is female. Women vote more than men vote. And also I heard and met Dr. Jill Biden January 2nd, and this question came up, and it was pretty clear her husband was going to choose a woman to be his running mate. And so given the last 2.5 weeks, I feel almost certain in my gut that Joe Biden is going to choose an African-American woman to be his running mate. Now, who's that going to be? Is it going to be Stacey Abrams, who really wants this opportunity, who for over 10 years served in the Georgia state legislature with the Democrats, was minority leader in the Democrats, ran in 2018 a very close race for governor of Georgia. Maybe if the election had been clearly honest, she might have won. That's Stacey Abrams. He was very articulate a month ago on MSNBC alongside Joe Biden. Also, Dr. Susan Rice, PhD, Stanford, National Security Advisor, 4 years for Joe Biden. Secretary of State, 4 years for Joe Biden. It worked in the Clinton administration. Very articulate. I met her back February 2nd of 2008. And she nudged me to support Barack Obama rather than Hillary Clinton. But she's never run for office. Very smart, but she's never had her name on a ballot. She hasn't run in a campaign before. Not to say that disqualifies you. After all, the current occupant of the White House had never run for office before. That's Dr. Susan Rice. The third person is Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala Harris, elected to the Senate from California in 2016. She is on paper, has an incredible resume. District Attorney for San Francisco, Attorney General of the state of California, U.S. Senator from California. California is 10% of our nation's population. If it were a country, it'd be the 7th wealthiest country in the world. The governor of California is a Democrat. If Kamala Harris on January 20th next year were to become vice president, the Democratic governor, Gavin Newsom, of California would appoint a Democrat to replace her. So she doesn't have the same problem that, say, Elizabeth Warren has in Massachusetts, where there's a Republican governor in Massachusetts. So again, if I had to choose right now, thinking and putting on my national delegate hat, I would tend to think Joe Biden's going to choose an African-American woman to be his running mate. And keep in mind how strategically important this is. Joe Biden is 77, almost 78. In 4 years, he would be about 82. And so there's a good possibility Joe Biden's not going to be running for a second term. In fact, the current occupant of the White House in 3 days will be 74. Before this election, Ronald Reagan had been the oldest elected at age 69. The average age in this country is age 38, 39, like Salt Lake City Mayor Aaron Mendenhall. He's the break-even average in age. So as I think it through, I think it comes down to Joe Biden with the people close to him saying, who, if you choose, are you positioning to be in a top position to run for president 4 years from now in 2024? It's going to be an African-American woman. And keep in mind, our country is changing. Yes, back when Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, 60% of Americans looked like me. Now, today, we're moving. So right now, it's about 42. It's 90%. Forgive me. 90% looked like me in 1968 of voters. Now it's 66%. We think by 2042, people that look like me will be a minority in this country. That's the movement in this country. So I don't know who it's going to be, but I think it's going to be an African-American woman, one of those three.
Susan Rice, huh? Interesting. Yeah. Next question, and we'll give it a few more minutes. So let's see if we can speed through a few of them. Can we get a copy of the lecture? Yes, at golearn.utah.edu. We're posting all of these, so you can even go back to some of the other ones. We have Stephen Trimble with Capital Reef Reader, Jane England and Tim Slover with a scrapbook of London. You can hear about the Vikings and so forth. So yeah, you can go back to this lecture at golearn.utah.edu. Wonderful lecture. Thank you so much for sharing this interesting comparison. Let's see. Do you feel, again, a loaded question, of course, right? Do you feel it is problematic to the separation of church and state that the president held up a Bible in the recent photo op?
Oh, well, we don't have the exact words in the Constitution, the basis for all U.S. law, saying separation between church and state. Those exact words we don't have. Now, I need to tell you, I grew up evangelical Protestant in Texas, and it alarmed me first when I saw what the president was doing. And then when he stood in front of that beautiful church, that's an Episcopal church, the church that Dolly Madison and James Madison attended back in the second decade of the 1800s. But then also, when I went to church, you brought your Bible and you held it a certain way. And Donald Trump held the Bible in such a way that made me think he was very unfamiliar with it. And so I then became not alarmed, I became embarrassed for him. And then when someone asked him, "Is that your Bible?" He said, "No, it's a Bible." That told me something as well. Now, what was he doing? It was a photo opportunity to send a message to his base. And maybe he will solidify his base, which about 35 to 40% of Republicans who vote self-identify as evangelicals, and about 2-to-1 ratio in the past, I don't know if it's true now, have identified with the Republican Party. That goes back to Jerry Falwell and Ronald Reagan back in 1980. Now, how that's going to translate with evangelical voters, we'll see on November 3rd.
Okay. All right. I've heard that the best way to judge what Mr. Trump is up to is by disregarding what he says and looking at his administration actually does. That is, words are a distraction from what he's really up to. Your thoughts?
I remember a quote from about 50 years ago. Words are nice, but actions are ultimate. You judge people on their actions. So, his words are one thing, but I look at his actions. For example, the executive orders, and those people who act on his behalf in the federal bureaucracy. So that's my view. Now, Nixon, as I indicated in my lecture, was someone who would sign bills that he was opposed to, but he wanted consensus. He wanted to win the election. In 1972, he was opposed to the Environmental Protection Act, but he signed the bill because, and ultimately won 49 of 50 states in 1972. Nixon was first a politician. This president is unprecedented. He does and says things that are counterintuitive, that are a conundrum, that seemingly he acts like he doesn't want to get reelected, or he assumes he's going to maintain power after he's defeated. I'm not sure how to figure him out. He is mystifying. There's nothing in our textbooks that describe the current occupant in the White House.
Yeah, one can study political science and one never knows what happens tomorrow, right?
I would tell my students in my opening day meeting with them, I would say, think of political science as problem solving. It's problem solving. That political science is not chemistry, not biology, not physics. It's not anatomy. It's problem solving. And that's what we're facing right now with the national health crisis, with a national security crisis, and the reaction of a public murder by a law enforcement officer in the last 2.5 weeks.
I hate to end on a sad note. We are coming to the end of our panel. We went through all the questions. We hopefully answered them. Hopefully this was interesting. I learned a lot. For anyone who's still out there, we still have the majority of the attendees there. You realize how encyclopedic Tim's mind is and how he works. I love it when you come from a date, you start with a day, go to the month, and then you nail the year in which whatever happened. And over the years that I've known you, Tim, it's been always a pleasure talking to you because you bring it down to the day, not just, in 1973. You seem to know exactly when the moment happened. So thank you. Again, tons of people out there saying, thank you very much. What an interesting panel. What an interesting webinar. Tim, thank you so much. Too bad we can't go to Washington, but maybe in May, we're hopefully on the airplane again and go.
Right.
Yeah, tons of things. I mean, it's coming in. People are just writing, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all
Right.
for participating. Thank you.
All right, this concludes today's webinar. Join us again next week at noon here. Next week we'll be with, let's make a little announcement here, Stephen Hall.
Good.
We are going to the beaches of Normandy and traveling back to 1944, the D-Day invasion. So thank you, Tim. Have a wonderful afternoon and a great weekend ahead.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Ben.
Bye.
Thank you.